We're here on another really lovely spring day on Long Island in New York, and I've got Apple on my lap to kind of help me explain things, right, Apple? Apple, can you help me explain? What? She says she's just going to sit here on my lap and look cute, but she's good at that. I've had some requests from people who would like to know a little bit more about vaccines for dogs, and vaccines are a big concern. The biggest concern really is over-vaccination. When you over-vaccinate your dog, if you give your dog more vaccines than are necessary to prevent illness, every single vaccine puts an additional strain on the immune system. And strain on the immune system can lead to all sorts of disastrous results. There's some thought that it may contribute to the incidence of autoimmune disease, and I did have one of my dogs die of an autoimmune disease a little bit before her time. Also, there's some speculation that it may be tied to some forms of cancer, and I've had a few cases of cancer that have been fatal to my dogs. So these are all very valid concerns. If you have nothing better to do, you might want to Google Dr. Ronald Schultz, who is preeminent as a canine immunologist, just recently retired but has been doing research since the 1980s about over-vaccination and how much vaccine is actually necessary to prevent disease. There's also Dr. Gene Dodds, also preeminent in the field of vaccinations and concerns for over-vaccination. I'll give you an outline of some of the most common vaccines and what I do. Keep in mind I'm not a veterinarian, so you should always consult with your vet before you make any final decisions as to what to do about immunizations. There are two core vaccines that you should always I don't know if anybody noticed, but a little bee or a fly buzzed by and Apple didn't miss a thing. Good girl. Anyway, there are two core vaccines that should be given. One is rabies, and rabies in almost every state, and possibly every state, is required by law. Usually one vaccine every 3 years. The protocol we follow is to give the first vaccine by the time the dog is 6 months old, follow up with a booster 1 year later, and then every 3 years after that. Dr. Schultz's research shows that the rabies vaccine probably is effective for at least 7 years, if not for lifetime. So the 3-year protocol should be just fine. There's also a combination vaccine, and it's probably the only combination vaccine that I would ever recommend, that takes care of distemper and parvo, both very serious diseases in dogs that you want to avoid, and usually is also in combination with other common diseases like adenovirus and parainfluenza. That is what's in what we usually refer to as puppy shots. Our protocol is to give 3 puppy shots that are spaced about 3 weeks apart, starting approximately when the puppy is 10 weeks old and then ending at about the age of 16 weeks. The reason we give multiple puppy shots is because puppies at that age still have an acquired immunity from their mother, and the antibodies that are present from the acquired immunity will interfere with the effectiveness of the vaccine. But of course you don't want to leave the puppies exposed to those diseases, so giving the series of 3 puppy shots is something that we do so that we can catch that moment when the acquired immunity from the mother wears off and the puppy needs to establish its own antibodies. A booster shot is recommended 1 year later. And then it gets a little tricky. After that, if you follow the protocol that some veterinarians recommend, but a lot now have changed, you would give annual revaccinations. On the little slip of paper that comes with the vaccines, it says that they recommend annual revaccination. But then think about it. That means over the course of a lifetime, a dog is going to have 15, possibly 20 doses of that vaccine. Every single one of them is an assault on the immune system. I would much rather cut that down to far fewer. The reason why the pharmaceutical companies still recommend annual revaccination is very plainly stated. On that same documentation that comes with the vaccine, it says that the duration of immunity has not been established. So in other words, they haven't run the clinical trials that are necessary to figure out how long the vaccine is good for. There are two recommendations that I would make, and you should discuss these with your vet and see if one of those would fit your needs. One, which is probably the best, would be to do what's called titer testing. Titer testing is a blood test. It measures the level of immunity that's in the bloodstream of the dog, and if the titers are high after a certain period of time, there's no need to revaccinate. And many vets, just covering up my microphone, and many vets will go along with titer testing in lieu of annual revaccination. And you might find that those vaccines are going to last 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, possibly even lifetime. If that's not feasible, because titer testing does have its own set of problems, it's expensive, it takes time because the vet's not going to be able to do the titer testing in office, so it has to go out to a lab. Another alternative, which I actually kind of like for my own dogs, is that after the puppy shots, the 1-year booster, after that, we give the vaccines every 3 years. And we do that until the dog's 10 years of age, and over 10 years, we stop vaccinating entirely. So that would then limit the dog to getting maybe 6 of those vaccines over its lifetime, as opposed to 15 or 20. If your vet would go along with that, you might also want to tell your vet that the current recommendations by a couple of big organizations like the American Animal Hospital Association have changed their protocols, to their recommendations for protocols to every 3 years. And the same's happening in pretty much all of the top vet schools around the country. Aside from those 2 core vaccines, there are a bunch of non-core vaccines that you might want to consider, but again, every vaccine is a strain on the immune system, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So let me mention a few of them. Bordetella is a very common vaccine. Bordetella is associated with kennel cough. The only reason I would consider Bordetella is if you are boarding your dog in a commercial facility, and some of them, as well as other facilities like groomers or dog schools or so on, may require a Bordetella vaccine. The one thing you have to know is that the Bordetella vaccine develops an immunity very quickly, usually within 2 or 3 days. So if you do deal with an institution that requires a Bordetella vaccine, you can give that just a couple of days before and then show proof of vaccination. Leptospirosis is a very serious disease caused by a microorganism. Again, it's something I don't give my dogs. Leptospirosis is transmitted by a microorganism that is spread in the urine of wild mammals, usually raccoons. It's spread in their urine, and it then can sit, if there's standing water that the urine is deposited in, and then your dogs drink from that standing water, it will transmit the disease to them. I don't have a lot of raccoons in this area. It's a suburban area. We do have some, but we seldom see them. Also, I don't have standing water here. I have very good drainage in my backyard, so even when it rains hard, I don't have to worry about standing water. The other concern about leptospirosis vaccine is that there are many variations, many strains of the disease, and the best lepto vaccines will cover 4 of those strains. There's very little cross protection, so your dog still could develop leptospirosis. There's also the possibility of adverse reaction to any of these vaccines for that matter, but I've particularly heard about adverse reactions to the leptospirosis vaccine. They can be mild, but there have been documented cases of serious reactions like seizures, occasionally even causing death. So it's something that we have to be very concerned about. There's Lyme disease vaccine. Now, Lyme disease is spread by ticks, and it's usually associated with deer ticks. Again, in the area I live in, being a densely populated area, I don't have deer nearby. We do get occasional tick outbreaks, but when we do, we treat the environment, and we also make sure that our dogs are free of ticks as much as possible. It is something that's prevalent in New England and the upper Midwest. If you happen to live in those areas and your vet tells you that Lyme disease is endemic to that area, you might want to consider Lyme vaccine. But keep in mind, it's another assault on the immune system, and there is the possibility of adverse reaction. And finally, there's also corona vaccine. Corona, in this case, not the same as COVID. It's a similar but a different virus that causes corona. Corona is something, again, that I never ever would consider giving to my dogs, because corona, although it's a very serious disease, when it does have an outbreak, it's generally very confined. It requires very close contact from one dog to the other to be transmitted. And so, I hope I'm not boring you, little girl. So I would never consider corona unless I know for a fact that there's an outbreak near me, and it's something generally not found in this area of the country anyway. So I hope that wasn't too boring for you, but keep in mind that we want to protect our dogs as much as possible, especially these wonderful, cute Cavaliers. Oh yes, I love you too. So, So we want to minimize the amount of vaccines we give, but we do want to give sufficient vaccines to protect our dogs from those diseases. So, hope everybody's doing well. Hope your dogs are doing well. Apple, say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Good girl.